part of the Greenlit Podcast Network.
From multiple influential locations in Minneapolis or near enough, this is Nice Games Club, the show where nice game devs talk gaming and game development. I'm Ellen Burns-Johnson, and I make nice games.
I'm Steve McGregor, and I make nice games.
And I'm Mark LaCroix. I, too, make nice games.
In this episode, we talk with Xalavier Nelson Jr., narrative director and writer for many, many games, to discuss bringing influences from other media into games. And so, if everyone is ready, let's start. Welcome, Xalavier.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me. In the moment, I kind of had an existential crisis spurred by your introduction because everybody was like, "Hi, I make nice games," and I suddenly just went out of my body and went, "Do I make nice games? What's the definition of nice games? Can I truly be said to be nice?" These are all questions that folks should ask themselves, perhaps on a daily basis. And I appreciate that Nice Games Club is forcing people to confront their own mortality and existence in this regard.
You know, you're the first to mention it in those terms, but maybe that's the fear we put in all our guests and just don't realize it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There's two things I look for in a podcast. It is existential fear and good people. And this one has both.
Hey.
Great. So sweet.
So I think you all connected via gig.
I actually met Xalavier at Game Devs of Color.
Oh, okay.
Last year. Back when we were, could meet in person.
Right.
It's a great conference, too.
So jealous.
Hear me out. There was over 100 people in this room.
Yeah.
It was a humongous health risk, and we just didn't know it at the time.
Yeah, we didn't. We wanted to talk to you about bringing influences from other media into games. I know that on Twitter and stuff, you're very active on the movies that you have watched and things you've learned from that. And we wanted to ask you a little bit about your experiences with that and what we can learn as developers from other things, from other media.
Yeah, the instant I started to see game development as and creativity in general as a holistic practice, what do you get from this album, this one single you listen to, that bad movie you watch on Wednesday night, it exponentially changes the way you can relate to your art. It exponentially improves the relationship you have with the world, I'd argue, because suddenly everything becomes a learning experience. Everything becomes an opportunity to see how another medium can benefit your own practice.
Yeah.
It's the number one way to become a better game developer is to do things that isn't making games in a lot of, isn't making or playing games in a lot of circumstances. Mm-hmm. It's a very odd relationship that I think is going to get picked up over time as our medium becomes more mature and has less of a root in a single place, because we're already clearly seeing the influence of video games and other mediums, right? Mm-hmm. From full-on albums inspired by video game characters, video game noises, of course, the rise of chiptune, to comics and movies, stuff like Dread, the 2012 movie, where people are like, it's the first good video game movie. It's not a video game movie at all. Director goes on to make Warcraft, which I would argue is underrated.
I agree completely.
Nice Games Club. Now this episode is about how Warcraft 2016 was underrated.
It was, though.
I also enjoyed it a lot.
I can leave the three of you alone with that thought if you'd like.
Bye, Mark.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, not at all. But this is the exact thing, right? If we are watching things outside of our bubble, or even within our bubble that are not particularly well regarded, it gives us this immense basis for creativity that otherwise just is not possible.
Yeah.
When you only look at the top 10 games in a generation.
Yeah. I like too that you introduced it not just as the greatest art, but even the garbage, but it still benefits from influence outside of games, right? That doesn't mean that you're trying to achieve some higher maybe that's faint praise, maybe that's not fair, but like just the way you framed it is just like all games should do this, like regardless of what your goal is, right?
I'd be more specific there, and even say just all game developers. There's a massive change in design practice and in the freedom you even have to communicate within a team. If the people within that team have read comics, listened to music, watched movies, have gone outside of the top 10 best-selling lists on Steam, outside of even if you're trying to make a great art, the idea of only trying to consume quote-unquote great art kind of hobbles you in a similar regard. It's one of the reasons that I'm intrigued by Netflix's decision to start showing rankings in its algorithm. So if you're browsing the Netflix front page, quote unquote, now they have one section that is objective, and that is just what are the top 10 titles in terms of both movies and TV that is in the United States right now. And if you're a certain kind of person, you're just going to gravitate towards that top 10. But in opposition to that regard, you also have this really interesting effect where if you're just like, I just watch things like this, maybe I just watch Marvel movies, and you look at Netflix because you're really excited about the next Marvel movie that got added to the catalog, and you see that the number 3 movie in the United States right now is Love Guaranteed, and the number 1 series is Cobra Kai. Number 4, Smurf. Number 6, Sister, which has been in the top 10 list all week. Like, realizing how much like even mainstream taste can differ from your own is also a valuable lesson.
That's very true, because I think we get like stuck on, especially like when we're working on games, we get stuck on popular games and we reference popular games a lot of the time. I mean, and it makes sense because like those are the references we have for like previous mechanics and things that we used in the past. But I think that like looking at how like games have been kind of separated from a lot of popular media, like in a way that is like very strange, despite the fact that like games are so popular. Like oftentimes people will say, I don't really play games, when no one really says, I don't really watch movies, right? Everybody's, most people watch movies every once in a while.
I think a lot of that comes from,
not so much with the games.
Doesn't that come from games I think we as artists who make games, we lament that fact, but I understand it because games is a thing you do, like it's an activity. So like, I don't like sports. So when people talk about how like, when I see like who won the Kentucky Derby as a push notification on my phone, I'm like, I'm not other people. I don't need that. Like, but I make games, and I do sometimes think like everyone should play games. It's part of the culture. It's one of the pillars of media. And it's like, well, if you don't, that's fine, I guess. But but that leads to then games can just easily eat their own tail because they're only about themselves and they're only servicing the people who are into games specifically. And that constantly makes me nervous.
Maybe partly because of what Mark was just saying about games having maybe a higher risk compared to other art forms and media forms of eating its own tail. Is the idea of a game maker going out and kind of curating and sponging in a lot of different influences, do you think that's more valuable to game makers as artists than it might be for other for makers of other art forms? It's a big question.
Absolutely agree with that.
Okay.
Because when you look at what games do, their primary benefit as a medium is synthesis and replication. And most of our development processes do not take advantage of this idea. So synthesis, games can take a theme, take an overall topic, subject, set of even things, of influences that we've seen before, and synthesize them in a way that by making them active makes them new. the people over at Rockstar get dinged for this a lot because people are like, you just take a bunch of movie scenes. You just took all the Westerns that you saw in this 6 years and you put them into Red Dead Redemption 2.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, whether or not that criticism is valid, we're a medium that does allow for that to feel completely new to millions of people, become the top entertainment launch of all time because of being rendered in this new interactive form that Mark referred to. The other major component here is replication, which is I cannot take the sets and flesh suits of the actors who worked on The Godfather and make a totally new film without that being deeply uncanny. It would feel really strange. Furthermore, like if I was to make The Godfather 2 through that context, right? Like reusing the same sound effects, musical cues, so on, it would feel strange and wrong. But games, I can take Resident Evil 4 and use much of the exact same technology and foundation of that and make Dead Space an entirely new, distinct experience with a unique creative vision and a utterly changed perspective that feels new despite being from something that's clearly the same, whether it's the same studio making the same kind of game or whether it's a different studio looking at what they did and being like, what if we did a tweak? I was about to say we're the only medium, but this is also true of music, which this is a larger topic, but I'd argue we're closer in terms of our work processes and what our medium enables and how our medium works to music than to film, which is what we're often compared to. And got the graphics. But much like music has sampling, in games, we have the ability to take the same exact components and have a complete reconstruction, deconstruction, or offshoot for new creative projects from the same place. And that often gets thrown out the window. And it shouldn't.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. And now I kind of want to like spend a week entirely reconstructing the vocabulary that I use around games to pull from music instead of something else. And I wonder if that, how that would influence my thinking around making, iterating and ideating. That's fascinating.
There's a risk there too, right? It's the thing about games eating their own tail is like everything very frequently, especially big AAA games tend to feel like remixes of other games. And that I think it's easy to be cynical about that. And I am cynical about that, but I could see the benefit, right? Of that kind of making things new from existing parts, but that there has to be room for something other than that, right? It is called
doing new things.
Hold on, let me write this down.
It's I have a seminar about it. It's $19.99. It will change your life. In all seriousness, we have. I'd argue that there's a lot that it's nearly impossible to get away from doing things that have been done before in some way, shape, or form. But this concept in games of not being remixes of ourselves, having a ability to bring something new from the same foundation, often doesn't come from the tools that are in use, but from the creator perspective that is presented. And one of the major reasons why I think this feels so endemic in AAA, despite Call of Duty being a perfect example, Call of Duty has massive system and mechanical level revisions and structural level revisions between every game. It is genuinely stunning to go through that back catalog, even to the first games and up till today, everything made after Call of Duty Modern Warfare 4, and see, they're actually doing massively different things. Same with Assassin's Creed, but because those games are released yearly, like Assassin's Creed was at a certain point, everybody's like, yeah, it's just the same. It's just the same. It's the same thing. I have a gun still. Why do I still have a gun? And I can get that. That's valid.
Yeah.
but also completely wrong and ignores all of the huge things that are occurring behind the scenes. But because these are yearly franchises that often do focus, at least in terms of the approach of their publishers or studios, in terms of scrubbing away the individual perspective of the developers involved, we recognize them as a congealed homogenous mass rather than what they are, which is distinct creative productions coming from a similar perspective. And for that exact case, I would raise up Vlambeer. Vlambeer, over the years, has made a lot of pretty damn similar games when you look in terms of their execution and everything else. But because they take whatever influences they have, take whatever technology they have, and they center this unique perspective they bring to the table every time, it doesn't feel like Luftrausers is the same as playing Nuclear Throne. And even if it did for you, it doesn't particularly matter because the individualism of that experience is fronted because of the diverse amount of stuff and the synthesized creative perspective of the people involved in building those things.
That's really interesting. I think that hits on what is interesting about this topic because like AAA games, they feel samey, even though they are probably, because they have the most people working on them and probably the most research gone into them. Mechanically, they might have even bring the most new ideas, but they still feel samey. But it might be a literacy issue because you hear people who don't love indie games, who are like who don't give them the time of day. A common complaint is, well, all indie games are the same, right? They're all just like little platformers, and they have like some silly story idea, or whatever. But this is the dimension on which those things are different, right? It's about like the approach and the overall structure and meaning. But if you're a gamer who is in it for the play and the play alone, you might value something different than what you're advising developers bring to their work. And I would make the argument that even for the audience who doesn't care about that, you make the game better for them even if they don't know it.
Yeah, there's a really good point there in terms of this is why you'll see a lot of games at least marketed in terms of something but different. So because as much as we seem to prize individuality, a huge amount of our what we define as popularity, which Netflix originals kind of demonstrated really early on in this sort of modern streaming news cycle was, people really love something new that they connect with. Like if it's new and they do connect with it, it's going to be genuinely market and life changing. But you know what people like as much, if not more, on a much more consistent basis? Something they've seen before. So you have Netflix hiring creators who have done a type of thing and being like, hey, Ryan Murphy, do your weird bullshit, but for us. And he comes in and he does his weird style of thing, but for Netflix. You have the Wayans brothers. I think it's Damon Wayans in particular right now, who they're like, hey, Damon Wayans, do some Wayans stuff. And he does some Wayans stuff. There's a difference. There's some new stuff that happens. But Stranger Things hailed as legitimately one of the most influential pieces of modern streaming television media. It's something you've seen before with one little twist. And you see that same effect happening in games. Often the presentation of novelty combined with the familiarity. I love first-person shooters, but oh man, here's a Portal gun. It's Portal. It's a totally different perspective on something I already love. Yeah. It can be both a cynically disturbing road to success, as well as potentially, at least as far as speaking as my own practice, a creatively enticing invitation to look at already covered material. Especially in indie, there's so much fear around doing something that's been done before. Oh man, someone else has already told an emotional story with low poly characters. Guess that entire genre is dead. Looking at that thing with this range of creative influences that have affected you, the amount of personal experience you bring to the table, realizing that you or at least creating a situation in which you are not a part of the homogenous mass, and then saying, if I made this exact same type of game, it would be different. This is what's new brought to the table by my perspective, by my practice, by the technology I'm using, and seeing that as a valuable thing. It's a context shift, like anything else, and context shifts are what make gaming go round.
Yeah. Oh man, I love that you brought that up too, because that's something we preach on this show all the time. Is that like, if you try to make the exact same thing that somebody else has done, it's going to be different because you are working on it. Mm-hmm. You have your own unique spin on it, even if you don't realize it. So I love that you brought that up. And I think that also what you're talking about here reminds me a lot about iteration too. Just basically, taking the thing you've made before and trying to improve on it or change it in a way that might make it different or better. And I think that like mirrors a lot of how game development tends to work in the back end too.
I think there's an intriguing component here of, I think you can see this individually in creators' careers as well.
Mm-hmm.
Especially, and sometimes it happens on the same project, because human beings remain static for a certain period of time, but not much longer than that. We're constantly changing in reality, and the more time that goes on, the larger those shifts become. So when you see a creator spending 6 years on a game, or a small team spending 6 years on a game and then releasing it, you'll see a lot of the pain from that process. Part of it comes from being in the same creative space for 6 years, being able to still occupy and iterate from the same basis for 6 years. Mm-hmm. You'll see in terms of creators making sequels to their own work, a difficulty to capture that magic box of where they were, who they were, and how they did it all over again. And this is part of why I do advise and advocate so hard for replication. Be like, yeah, ship your games faster, make them smaller scale, but also consider for your next thing, not doing a sequel, but like something that is functionally similar but has an entirely different perspective. Because your perspective has changed over time. Let's be real. Yeah. And if your work shows a significant change, if when you're next going to create a given project, you don't do the sequel to, let's say, the top-down shooter you did before, but it's like, what if you did this but a different theme? Something not just to shake it up for the players, but also to shake you up, to make it just different enough for you to be able to apply your new perspective, the new things you've learned in the interim to this topic. I think it in fact, just like on how the front end, the mixture of the familiar and the new makes something completely new for people. For creators, it can be that little bit of, what if we just made this just, quote unquote, what if we just made this space themed instead of fantasy? And seeing how significantly that changes a process in a project, it's valuable for the creators too.
One studio that's put out a game, I think I've played almost every game that they've put out, but I feel like they take that advice. I'm not sure if you gave it to them and they're just following it, or they stumbled upon it on their own. But Supergiant, because with the potential exception of Pyre, it seems like their games do kind of iterate on some consistent aspects. The art style can sometimes feel similar. The way that you're looking at your character seems similar. The combat can really, really change though. And then like the style of storytelling and the stories themselves are very, very different, from like Bastion to Transistor, and Hades now is, I think, in early access, or it's still in development. It's been really interesting to kind of play each of their games as they come out, because they do seem to come out every few years pretty regularly, not too long between releases. And there are familiar elements in there, but lots of new things as well. And as a player, it is really captivating. And exciting because I know I've liked all of their games so far. I'm excited to see what they'll do next because I know it will feel really different. But I also know it will feel like a super giant game.
It builds on itself. They're one of the studios who build on their previous work in the most effective way that I've seen in this medium, because 3 out of 4 of their games have been isometric action games.
Yeah.
But you can see from Bastion, they had the initial basis of isometric combat and switching weapons. In Transistor, they had the idea of applying similar effects to the same weapon and having exponential change based off of the things you apply to it. And those things interacting with each other. And now in Hades, their most successful game to date, which is about to come out of early access, you've got a game in which you switch between multiple weapons, which have different capacities, and all of those weapons have modular effects, which ping pong off of each other over the course of but as applied to a roguelike run. So you take a blessing from a god when you're using and a blessing from a different god, and it's the exact same effects, but those feel totally different when applied to the bow playstyle as opposed to the hammer. And even if they aren't reusing the same technology, because they're using the same operational knowledge as a team across these games, they can build that stuff and smash their own work together and tear it apart and remix it in far more consistent and faster ways than anyone else could if someone else was trying to make Hades. And they get to bring one of my favorite roguelike games I've ever played, maybe the best one I've ever played, to life as a result. It's wild.
And it's interesting because I can see genes, I guess, from Pyre in there as well. Like you can see how they've learned how they learned from their previous experiences and how they're taking that forward, but they are absolutely trying something new.
Speaking of Twitter, did we just talk about Twitter?
Who is speaking of Twitter?
I'm speaking of it now.
Stephen, you're editing this episode. You can put it in wherever you want.
That's true. Oh, I can. I am editing this episode. I can put this wherever. Well, at any rate, Twitter is cool. Dale is cool, and Dale does our Twitter, Nice Games Club. And you can follow us at Nice Games Club. A recent tweet that Dale posts on there was a friendly reminder not to include the post-launch period in your budget. Most of the things that Dale posts are silly and fun, but some of the things Dale posts are informative and interesting and valuable for game devs like us. So we have those retweeted as well. And so if you'd like to get all of these fun, fancy insights, you can follow us on Twitter at Nice Games Club.
So it's not just frog cats, but also game dev tips.
Yeah.
At Nice Games Club.
Hey there, this is Jeremy Parrish, and if you're a fan of classic video game soundtracks, or if you just love 20-minute rock epics about war-ready armadillos that battle Catholicism, you should listen to Alexander's Ragtime Band. Join the power trio of myself, Elliot Long, and James Eldred each month as we talk about the most pretentious music of all, progressive rock, right here on the Greenlit Podcast Network.
Welcome to Casual Magic, the show where we explore the fun side of Magic the Gathering. I'm your host, Shivam Putt, and each week we delve into everything from casual formats to explorations of creatures and card types to interviews with designers of the game. At Casual Magic, we believe that it just isn't Magic without the Gathering. Come along and play.
I like that, we're talking about this in that direction too, because I think this also is mirrored in other medium as well. I think that you can see this from directors' movies over time. They oftentimes will be chasing after the same thing. I think that one movie that came out with the old white guys. I'm sorry, I can't remember.
The Irishman?
Yes. There's a lot of movies with old white guys. I'm glad you.
Can you be more specific?
Irishman is a perfect example because it's Martin Scorsese making a thing with the same people who he's been making it with for years.
Yes.
And it turning into a real existential heck of a thing because he's been making the same thing and he's aware enough of a creator to talk about his own work through his work.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, and like those kinds of examples, you can see that traced throughout. I think like directors, movie history.
That's
I
really
think that
interesting.
track.
And Martin Scorsese is an example. Everyone has their own opinion on movies and his work in particular, but like I like him as a director quite a lot, but I hate all of his most Martin Scorsese movies. Like The Irishman did nothing for me because it was just vanilla Martin Scorsese. But I think those movies that he does that feel like his core canon, which don't speak to me at all, I think those inform his more interesting work that I am a fan of. And so I try to remember that like there's a rhyme and reason to it, even if parts of it are not for me. But I know
what you'll usually see is, I was just gonna say, what you'll usually see is like for Scorsese in particular, which is, I've used this as his exact example, so which is how I was able to identify. Well, The Irishman, that's the old white dude you're talking about.
Yeah.
He will usually make one or two. He'll make basically 2 movies on a theme, and then he'll move on, even if there's years between them. So, The King of Comedy, which is one of my favorite pieces of work in whatever genre it is the movie right before that was Taxi Driver. Taxi Driver came out, and if you look, I watched these 2 movies back to back. They are so dang similar in their terms, in their teams, in their execution. But The King of Comedy is an exponentially more interesting movie, and also wouldn't have been possible because Taxi Driver exists. They made Taxi Driver. They got really famous. They were like, wow, fame. They experienced parasocial relationships before we had a term for that. And they were like, wow, fame is messed up. The very concept of it is messed up. And then they made The King of Comedy. He's a prime example of the production processes of film are such that you can have people, directors, artists, and creators in that sphere make things within the span of, even if there's a long period of pre-production or funding raising, which can last from a brief period of time to decades. In the case of the new Bill and Ted, they actually shoot within a period of usually around 3 months. Even in terms of a Marvel movie, you're looking at like, for all the scale of that, they shoot within 9 months. They make the entire thing within about 2 years. And that gives them the freedom to run on a theme and then switch to another theme while still bearing all of the lessons of the past.
Well, Stephen was saying earlier, like that you make the same thing that someone else makes, and it's different because it is you're the one making it. But likewise, this is what musicians, filmmakers, and game designers get into this problem where they try to replicate their success. They are not that same person anymore. They're a different version of themselves. And so you can run into trouble by trying to bring another version of yourself to it and not being open enough to who you are now. Having grown and learned and failed and all of that along the way. Like your Scorsese example is example of it working the way it's supposed to. But there's plenty of examples where people just tried to make the same thing again as if they were that person who made the first one.
I was just on a game development cycle that had this happen in a positive way. And it was Frog Fractions 3, which is technically Frog Fractions 4. It's now public knowledge that Frog Fractions 3 is hidden inside of Frog Fractions 1, the HD collection that just came to Steam. If you buy a cosmetic hat DLC and wear it, the little frog starts with the hat, and then things get weird. And I've been consulting on that project for since around its inception. And one of the big things that we talked about throughout that process was still hiding it within, like even hiding it within the bones of Frog Fractions 1. Jim isn't the same person who made Frog Fractions 1. He's got this basic experience he didn't have before. He's made things that weren't that before. He's picked up new interests. He's gotten married, had a kid. There's a polar personal change vectors of what makes him happy, or what his id or what chaotic even means to him, which has evolved so much since Frog Fractions 1, while people are calling for Frog Fractions 1. So what do? The thing that he ended up doing, and that I'm really glad that folks, including myself, pushed him to allow himself to do throughout the process, was be honest with that and not try to do Frog Fractions 1 again.
Mhm.
Because if you make Frog Fractions, especially something so idiosyncratic like that, and try to get the magic again, just do the ping-ponging, it does not come from the same internal place, then it falls apart. It's like a bad tribute band of your own work. And I think independent developers in particular know the pain of not living up to yourself and the fear associated with that.
Yeah. But like, that reminds me though of like when you brought up like, bands that, are former versions of themselves. Like oftentimes when, I don't know, AC/DC or whoever, I don't listen to rock, go on tour, they like will play the same hits that they, everybody wants to hear. They don't make their own. They oftentimes will not like play their own original music, or they won't very frequently when they're,
Here's one from the new
greatest
album
hits.
to Waves of Booze, right?
Yeah, exactly. So like, I think in the other, like from a player perspective, I think a lot of people do want that. I know. I think it's important that you are true to yourself and true to the changes that you have, made over time. But I think that players feel differently because, like, there's a lot of aspects of game development that are hard to understand and that they don't understand.
Play Freebird.
Exactly. Yes.
Well, the way that musicians in particular who hate playing their hits from 20 years ago but have to feed themselves, a lot of times they get around it by doing new arrangements, bringing on new instrumentation, doing something interesting and unique with it, stretching it just enough to make the crowd happy. But that exact thing that you were mentioning earlier, which is that familiar but new but different. And the people who can do that well are, good for them, because then they can actually feel creative and actually make something new, while sort of fulfilling both of those things. But it is interesting to hear a version of a song from 30 years ago performed by the original artist that sounds different enough, and then you like, oh, because it reflects who they've become as an artist.
Mm-hmm.
There's a specific way in which this has occurred in games, which I would love to draw y'all's attention to if you haven't ever heard of it. Are you familiar with the Destiny 1 song made by Paul McCartney, Hope for the Future?
Yes.
Vaguely.
Are you aware that it has 5 distinct arrangements by what I believe are 5 different creative teams?
That's more than I would have guessed.
Wow.
Hope for the Future, at the time of its creation, was... I'm looking for it has... So you have Hope for the Future. There's Hope for the Future Thrash, Hope for the Future Beat Session Mix, Hope for the Future Jaded Mix, and Hope for the Future Mirawai Mix. And I don't know how intentional this all was, but it's a fantastic example of what you cited here is like, okay, Paul McCartney doing a Destiny song. God bless him. What does that look like as cast through 5 different prisms?
Yeah.
And it gets wildly different. It gets strange. The thrash mix, it bangs. I've bopped to it. And I'm like, what am I bopping to? And I check the place, it's like, oh, it's Hope for the Future.
No, but yes.
Embrace the hope to the future of your own medium. Like, what is the remix of yourself or of someone else that will spark joy?
Yeah.
That's a question I'm really interested in finding right now. And if we're making games on timelines that enable us to sort of noodle around on those things within a period of 1 to 2 years, I think that there's a really interesting space to explore that.
Mm-hmm. And like the vector to do it is, and I think we've been circling it this whole time, is like it isn't always about the new technology or the new mechanic. It's those influences. There's so much more that should inform those creative choices. and it can be frustrating when developers will, this game but that game rather than this but that.
The more influences you have in you, the more your art will, by necessity, by like just inherent effect, change. And that is why actually one of the most terrifying things to experience is a band, for example. Let's use band as a more existential term. When a band can play their hits perfectly after 30 years, that means they haven't absorbed new things. They haven't become new people. If they are playing the exact same music, it gains a sensation of the uncanny.
Yeah.
Rightfully so. And in 30 years, I want to have not just seen things that made me different, listened, watched things that made me different, but done things that mean I have both the freedom and the sad goodbye. That means I can't make the same thing I made anymore.
Yeah.
It's one reason why one of the projects I'm working on right now, Dog Airport game, I'm kind of looking forward to shipping it because it is the type of game and it does have the type of passion around it in terms of its audience where I can make it, I could noodle on it for another couple of years and have it come out and try to be a hit or whatever else. But also, if I ship it very soon, I get to say goodbye to it. I get to create post-launch content for it. I get to see even in a few years, because like we could do post-launch updates now. I could even see in a few years on a free weekend being like, what would it feel like to make some new NPCs for Dog Airport game and have those into the game and have the community receive those. The priority for my process right now is looking at all of the mediums and influences we have, including how those influences come to and change and alter the melting pot of ourselves, and trying to find the ways in terms of production, in terms of creativity, in terms of medium that allow me and the folks around me to take advantage of that ability. I want to be the best, most different version of myself in a positive ways, right?
Yeah.
In 1 year.
Yeah.
And I think it's really easy not to have the freedom to do that if you're working on a project. If in 1-2 years I'm only midway through my current project and I have to stay in the same creative place.
You hear that, Steven? Release Vengeance already.
Yeah, I've been working on the same game for 7 years now. But like, I think that Vengeance is the same thing, and also the way that we've been working on Vengeance, frankly, is the same way. Like, I mean, we have been working on it for 7 years, but it's changed so much over those 7 years. It used to be a mobile game that like people would pass their phones around and play on, and now it's like a
if people pass around a phone, they all get COVID, and they blame you.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. It's not possible anymore.
That's why we changed it 6 years back. We knew COVID was coming.
You knew?
No, I wish I
Nice
did
Games
too.
Club, more like nice not telling us about the future club.
I had nothing to do with this.
Yeah, Steven, how
Blame
could you?
Steven.
This has changed dramatically. But like the way that Vengeance has changed, like also works with, and the way that we work on Vengeance too, and like how we oftentimes will like come back to it over time. Like we have like spurts of like a lot of work on it, where we'll like, put in a bunch of things. Oftentimes it's like new content and stuff. But then like we'll stop working on it a lot for like months. And then we'll come back to it again. We'll add new content and change a bunch of stuff that we feel makes more sense now than we did in the past. And I think that like Vengeance as an overall, I wish we had different builds from like past years and stuff, because Vengeance as an overall process has changed because our team has changed.
Yeah, that
How we
process
work on
is
games
similar as Xalavier is describing, but rather than releasing the game and new
Right.
games, it's internal. So it can be expressed different ways. So like, David Bowie reinvents himself for every album, but still feels like David Bowie. But Tom Petty makes another bunch of songs that could have been released in 1987, but they still feel new and fresh. Like it's not, there's no one way. Or like Supergiant puts out these games that have this lineage, but then you have like Platinum Games, which makes pretty much the same thing, like even more so. But they still learn and evolve and grow. I think opinions can vary, but it doesn't have to express itself in the world in the same way. And this is not just me just being charitable to you and the fact that Vengeance isn't out, but please release Vengeance. But there's not one, and that's the whole point. There's not one way to do anything, right?
Yeah.
There's healthy ways to do things. There's smart ways to do things, depending on your goal and your, whatever, but there's not one way.
Yeah.
Do y'all ever think about this in terms of, as far as like the negative example of this, do y'all ever think about this in terms of like the Half-Life 2 development cycle / debacle? Because when you look at all the documentation for that, which is notoriously deep, they made essentially 3 to 4 different types of games and threw them all out before we have the Half-Life 2 that we got now.
Yeah.
Sometimes I think about how much of that going in circles, spinning around the same thing, comes from only absorbing or focusing on a certain amount of things or off of a internal team change. Like if you have a static petri dish environment and you drop one new thing inside, the entire thing changes again. And I kind of wonder about how much development how valid would it have been for Valve to have made and shipped the first version of Half-Life 2?
Mm-hmm.
What would that look like? What would games look like? How much of long-term game development, how things are based off of folks trying to only make something on a certain set of influences for a certain amount of time, instead of like the healthy version of this is like, how much has Vengeance's continued momentum and progress healthily been affected by allowing that stuff to iterate behind the scenes and taking in new things over time, instead of playing the same 3 chords and hoping that something new will come out, that you'll discover a 4th chord while playing the same 3 chords for 6 years.
Yeah. I mean, the game has gotten I think it's at its best version of the game now because of all of the things that we've done to improve it and change it. And like we've made massive changes to things. Like I mean, we can. I don't want to go into all the history of of the game, but like there's just been a lot of like massive changes that makes that to get to where we are now, and that has been due to like all of the different things. And like to be honest, I tend to be the person who like fights against changes because like I don't know, I don't want to do more work, but like it. I think that like the changes we've made have very often made the game better as a result of that. And like me fighting against those changes is also me like recognizing what worked in the past and trying to acknowledge that and trying to push us towards a direction that will make the game better, but not just different, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so like that back and forth that like me and my team has working on the game makes the game better as a result of that. And like me changing and me realizing that the past me was like, this thing should stay the same. Whereas like future me is like, no, that doesn't make any sense. This doesn't really matter in the long run. Things like that makes the game morph into something more as the result. Wow, that was a lot of words, but
well, you have to be. There's production realities. Like when we were working on Widget Satchel, I was really. We've made this decision. The decision was made. I don't care if we've changed our minds. We have to get this game out, and that's in service of a production reality, right? That's at the risk of creative flourishing, right? Yeah, and so you have to balance those things. The trick is you want to be Half-Life 2. You don't want to be Duke Nukem Forever.
Right.
Right.
Good point. Very good point.
Yeah.
And it's hard to know which one you are, right? While you're in it.
Unless your name is Duke Nukem, in which case I have bad news for you, bud.
Someone made that choice for you.
Yeah. Well, imagine if that game came out when it was originally scheduled to, and was as gross and regressive as it ended up being 100 years later. Like, imagine, but it stayed in the zeitgeist. Imagine what could have happened if they then made a 5th one and a 6th one, and then maybe it actually grew with the industry. Not that I mean, I'm happy Duke Nukem is out of our lives. I'm very happy of that. But like, but things grow when they're exposed to light, you know? So like, I do kind of wonder. I mean, there's not a lot of hope for that, but I'm just imagine that alternate universe. Like you're saying, imagine the universe where they did release the first version of Half-Life 2. What would be different? That's true of famous disaster projects too. Could those creators have learned and made something better? Could they have, grown as artists? And could we, as with our critical eye, have contributed to the understanding and literacy of the industry by having more things in the world to look at? I mean, that's just another indictment against the secrecy of this industry. But
I will always mourn the XCOM FPS. As much as we love the current version of XCOM that has come around by Firaxis, right before that, they announced the FPS that was being made by 2K Marin and Company, and it was drawing from so many different places. It was drawing from the Cold War 50s paranoia. It was drawing from previous stuff the team had worked on, like BioShock. It was drawing from so many dang influences and places and things, and wasn't allowed to come to light in the version it was. They were forced to noodle, and so they went through that tortured development process and ended up releasing a deeply interesting but also compromised third-person shooter, Tactics Hybrid. And the version that captivated me when I was younger of that thing of XCOM, before I'd even known what XCOM was, that was my first introduction really to the series, outside of knowing that, hey, there's a really popular tactics game that old people talk about. It's where there's aliens, and Sid Meier designed it as something. And seeing that and seeing that version of the game die, I think a lot about dead versions of games, things that are presented that we only see the tip of, or that we never get to see at all because it's buried behind internal, game dev secrecy. I just think about that a whole lot, and how our medium is the worst for those things existing, if only so we can look at them, look at the total amount of things in the world, and make things based off of that. It is hard to make games or make good creative work based off of a single medium when most of the things in that medium have already, before they come to you, been winnowed down by the seas of fate. When 100 games have been in development and we only get 10 of those, you can't learn a whole bunch from just playing video games because you only got 10 of the 100. I think about that a lot.
This is where film is an advantage because unproduced scripts are available. Movies that are announced and in production get talked about in trade magazines publicly, even if they never see the light of day. Canceled games...
Music has demo tapes.
Yeah. But canceled games just disappear, and people can't even put them on their resumes.
You can find sketches, like practice sketches from some of the most famous painters. It's part of the catalog of work that historians have gathered, where you can see, okay, yeah, this is a sketch that this person did during this period in their life when they were working towards doing this particular portrait that ended up being very famous. And you can even do analysis of the paintings themselves, where they did other paintings underneath, and then they painted over the top of that. Like, you have all this history, but yeah, we don't really have that for games.
I haven't really had the chance to say this much before, but I do want to have it on the record as far as like how I make things. The thing that made me a better storyteller for video games was reading comics. I was one of those children growing up who was like, I don't read comic books I don't read things with pictures. I read the picture of Dorian Gray and Upton Sinclair's The Jungle when I'm far too young for that. And I thought it was going to be about an actual jungle, like the Jungle Book. But actually, I learned about the abuses of the meatpacking industry in Chicago.
That's good. That's also good.
Also a valid thing. At the age of 10, wasn't the most relevant thing I could have or should have been learning.
Yeah.
But
Shrug.
coming to comics, a medium that I had explicitly disdained, and then saying, what is this medium doing? Who are the people doing things there? What are the things that speak to me here? How does this medium operate? How can it be applied to my experience elsewhere? That made me a better creator. I didn't used to listen to music really until I got deep into not just making video games, but especially being in leadership positions for games. If I'm not having influences piped into me and listening to things that even people on my team care about that I have dismissed in the past, the common thread here is when I dismiss other mediums, I was always wrong. When I dismiss other creations and things, I was almost always wrong. Because every single one of those things that I absorbed and took into me led to the person who I am now and the things I can make now that a previous version of me couldn't because of that dismissive attitude, because of that limited range of experience. One of the reasons why you'll see work by children and teenagers is so limited and not great is because they read Harry Potter and that's it. And then they're like, I'm going to do a dark, gritty crime story. And it's very clear that they saw Sin City by Robert Rodriguez, and they happened to sneak into watching that, or they managed to get an access to Netflix Unguarded, and they watched Frank Miller's Sin City, and they've seen Harry Potter, and they've just put those two things together, and that's so limited. And at the very least, when you have so much to draw from, when you have so much that is in you, it makes theft so much harder to detect, and that is, I think, something we can all advocate for.
Is getting away with it.
Steal more frequently, please. I like that. It brings back that talk that you did at the Game Devs of Color. A little bit, yeah. Asset
reuse everything, especially other people's things.
Yeah. Right. Creation itself is a myth, right? Like it's all about combination, right?
Creation and combination. Make new things, make old things. Maybe it's the same thing. At a certain point, we don't know anymore. We just make nice games. Please don't sue us.
That's an excellent thesis to end on, I think.
Yeah.
I think so too. So one other thing we always try to close with is, where can people find you on the internet, and what kind of things are you working on now?
I'm making a lot of really cool things. Foremost among them, things like Skatebird, which is coming out in 2021, and An Airport for Aliens, currently run by dogs, which is coming out is planned to come out in 2020. Currently, the place where folks can find me, as well as horrible puns and jokes of varying levels of quality, is at Rit Nelson on Twitter, WRIT Nelson. I've got a Patreon, but it isn't particularly relevant. I'm stoked to be here, and it was an honor to chat to you nice games folks.
Yeah, thanks for being here.
Yeah,
Well, really appreciate you having you on.
You want to do the outro, Alan?
Yeah, sorry, I thought you were saying something.
No, I was
And you
done.
were, and then this is why I wish we could record in person again.
Yeah.
But Steven didn't tell us about the pandemic, so here we are.
Well, oops.
You learn for next time. Next pandemic, you just keep us in the loop.
Yeah.
I'll let you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's our show. Check out our website, nicegames.club, for show notes and links to resources on today's topics. If you'd like this episode, give us a review on your favorite podcast app and tell your friends. Independent podcasts like ours rely on word of mouth to grow. We love hearing from our listeners. That's you. For a quick way to give us feedback on the show, head over to nicegames.club/feedback and fill out a short little form. You can also get in touch with your nice hosts on Twitter at Nice Games Club, where Dale tweets about game dev resources and petting dogs in Crusader Kings 3. Or you can email us through contact@nicegames.club. Ask us questions, suggest topics, just say hello, or ask Steven when Vengeance will be out.
Don't do that one.
I'll record the last one. Okay.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Keep it in.
I thought it was a really good one, but also I'm watching the Vengeance trailer now, and it's rad, by the way.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
So until we start again, remember to
Play nice.
And make nice.
And make other people's stuff.
Make other people's stuff.
Yeah.
But different.
Legally distinct from, but yeah.
What if it was called Legally Distinct Games Club? If I heard a podcast start with, I'm Ellen Burns Johnson and I make legally distinct games, instantly, I have so many questions. I'm pulled in. This is a mystery I need to unravel.